looking at the 10 years of the National Anti-Corruption Forum, where the government, business and civil society come together to combat corruption, we found that we have come a long way over the last 10 years in combating corruption by putting in place legislation and policies that deal with corruption and also to educate the public about the causes and effects of corruption. However, we've also found that over the past 3 years particularly, there has been an increase in the cases of corruption, in the amount that the state has lost because of corruption. When it comes to provision of government service delivery, as well as the relationship between government and the private sector, understanding that government buys, procures services through the tendering system from the private sector, and we have been particularly concerned about those relationships. So it was a question of rededicating ourselves in terms of lifting up all the measures that we can do, holding hands to fight corruption going forward.
I think it is important that you say the last 3 years, though, have seen an increase, particularly where procurement is concerned. Why is that so? Are you able to tell us?
We found that the legislation that is in place does not talk to one another. There is no synergy between whistleblowing mechanisms, between the issue about declaring of interest by elected and appointed officials who often sit in the committees that adjudicate and allocate tenders, as well as the concern now about the state secrecy bill. We find that the environment of openness and providing information freely does not exist. And in fact, we have receded as a country when it comes to that. In fact, the perception, which in most cases is a reality, that you do not necessarily have to report incidents of corruption because nothing is going to be done, is very high among the public in South Africa. And so we said we need to turn around those things so that ordinary people can know that when they report these cases, there will be investigation, and that certainty that somebody will be investigated, prosecuted, can be a deterrent going forward.
All right, let me bring in Mr. Vavi. I've just received a media alert from COSATU that right this moment you're on the way to Polokwane, where you will be leading a march against corruption there. But why?
Well, we have been marching all over the country as COSATU. We have been occupying the streets to raise our deepest concern at the escalating incidents of corruption all over South Africa. And so Limpopo is not an exception. In fact, this is a second march we're holding in just a few months in between. Precisely because Limpopo, as everybody in South Africa will have to come to accept, is one of the areas where there are high incidents of corruption. So we're duty bound to return today on the 13th of December to the streets of Polokwane to demand answers to the demands that we submitted in October this year.
What are those demands again?
Those demands is that government must do everything within its power to root out corruption in the state, and we have not seen any decisive action indeed. Instead, what has happened is that government has been forced last week to intervene in Polokwane and take over running of 5 administrations of the province, highlighting the extent of maladministration, which we have no doubt in our mind is linked to a huge tender corruption underway in this province as well as elsewhere in the country. Those demands say that the government must build capacity to provide services directly and stop building these agencies and or outsourcing its responsibilities in a manner that then gives space to the corrupt elements within the government and in our movement to take advantage and to milk the fiscus dry. And those are the demands that we continue to pursue even in the march today.
Let me just paint a picture then of the national picture. Is it the same as Limpopo, Mr. Vavi, or is it peculiar to Limpopo?
No, it's all over. It's all over. and I don't think that Limpopo is an exception, but Limpopo is one of the worst examples. There can be no doubt of the fact that, when you have a Minister of Finance that says government is investigating tender fraud worth over 25 billion rands, then you must be extremely concerned. When the Special Investigating Unit of the country reveals that up to 20% of all money that is meant to deliver basic services or to our people that continue to be marginalized economically 17 years into our democracy, then it says to us it is time to stand up and to be counted and to do something practical about that. When the SIU tells you that it has almost 1,000 individuals or 1,000 individual investigations underway, that almost 600 of these relate to procurement involving contracts worth more than 9 billion rands. And alongside the units investigating 360 cases of conflict of interest in contract valued at over 3.5 billion rands, then you must know that that country is in a serious crisis. And in fact, we're no longer just in a crisis. I think that the corruption problem in South Africa is a complete catastrophe that requires the measures that we were considering in the anti-corruption conference on Thursday and Friday last week.
Mr. Nyembezi, let me come back to you then. The tipping point, where is the tipping point? Are we reaching the tipping point in as far as corruption is concerned in this country?
Yes, indeed. I mean, if there can be people who can go scot-free, after having committed acts of corruption, it does paint a bad picture. For example, we're supposed to have a list of people who have been prosecuted and penalized, disciplined within government processes, so that they are put up on the list that the public can know. But what we see is that we do not have such a list. People who we know have been found guilty of corruption, they are transferred to other departments, they come from provincial to municipalities, or they leave government after having received handshakes. And that is a serious concern. In fact, it goes back to the issue of the political will that you've asked about, because I believe that political will in the mixed bag that we spoke about, it lands towards more lack of political will. If you take in a case of the the Competition Amendment Act, which the last summit had resolved that the act needs to be amended so that we can deal with the issues of cartels, collusions, and price fixing. And that act has been in the pipeline since 2008, when the president signed it into law, but it has not come into effect. And yet we know that companies are queuing in front of the competition authorities, applying for leniency. We've got a bread case here that has been taken to court by civil society. We've got issues about milling and all that. So there is a lack of political will when Parliament fails in its oversight role to ensure that it passes legislation, it amends legislation, and it plays an oversight role over the executive.
Okay.
And when the executive just unilaterally delays implementation of some of these acts, that points to lack of political will.
Okay. All right, Mr. Nyembezi, thank you. Dr. Woods, I haven't heard from you. I just wanted to get from you, I mean, you research these things, and listening to my two speakers already, it sounds like we're in a mess.
Yes, I would agree with both speakers. All evidence that we have would indicate that we have a serious problem, and that government at this point has not established a full repertoire of responses to corruption. And our belief is that government hasn't built the big picture of what the underlying causes of corruption are, how the sociological drivers of corruption, and exactly what's happening within a typical government department. And so far as that goes, the repertoire of responses is very narrow, mostly, as has been mentioned, the provision of laws and investigating agencies. And in both those cases, they're not too effective. The laws is a large degree of non-compliance, and we have some doubts as to the competency of many of the investigating agencies. So corruption carries on unabated.
But in quantitative terms, are we worse off than many countries, or is it something that happens elsewhere in the world? Because people argue that no, but I mean, you're making a big deal out of something that happens elsewhere as well. It happens in the US, it happens in the UK.
Well, if I looked at the Transparency International Perception Index of Corruption, we're sitting at position 64 out of 180 odd. So that would suggest we're more or less in the middle. But of course, there's a lot of criticism of that perception index and the methodologies they use. But, we have to, every country's corruption is different. Our corruption seems to be perhaps similar to that what we're experiencing in Russia and more recently in China, where you have societies in transition, where there's a lack of social structure, where value systems are in flux. And so I think that's who we should be comparing ourselves against. But to me, once again, it gets back to how you respond to it. I don't think anybody has the absolute answers, but certainly we could increase the way we intervene, the way government intervenes, as opposed to a few external interventions of, as I say, law and investigations, but to work more closely within the problems that exist within most government institutions, which is where the corruption actually takes place.